Welcome back to Paris Lesbos. One of us is a pixie, the other gets called Rena. You may think at first that we're taking a detour down a side branch of this network of tunnels, as this woman's name probably won't ring any bells for most of our listeners. Mary Sophia Allen is known as a suffragette turned pioneer policewoman in the UK, but she also fell into supporting fascism and forming a private woman army to combat communist aerial attacks, nudity, and white slavery, as the cover flap of a biography about her states.
Oh, this is going to be interesting.
As always, we start at the beginning. Born in March 1878, Mary Allen was from an upper middle class family of a railway engineer whose job allowed him to take his family on trips both domestic and abroad.
And where were they based?
England.
And we don't know any more than that?
We don't really, because we don't actually know a lot about her childhood. Allen never went into detail about it across her 3 memoirs. The biographer Nina Boyd did do some genealogy hunting, basically, looking at documents and whatnot. Basically the same sort of documents you could probably find on like a site like Ancestry.com if you went looking for various people. So like birth certificates, census records, that sort of thing.
But we don't have a lot from her about her early childhood and how that might have affected her views based on where she was or the people she knew.
No, instead we get like the bare bone facts of she had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. One of her sisters later joined her in her police work. One brother died as an infant, and then another died in World War I. The most we get beyond that is we know that her father's work allowed her and her sisters to attend a boarding school in Switzerland and to take music lessons in Germany. This is in addition to being educated at home by governesses first, and Mary at least also attended one of the first UK academic girls' schools, a Princess Helena College in London.
Wow, so she's getting a lot of advantages. We know that.
Now, the majority of our reliable information begins in 1909 when Mary becomes a suffragette.
So all that education got into her brain and made her have some thoughts, did it?
As it is supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect there's a few of you, though, who are surprised that we start the story of a fascist with marching for women's votes. In that case, both this episode and the next will be interesting for you. Now, Mary's father did not approve. According to her memoirs, he gave her an ultimatum to give it up or get out of the house. So she got out of his house, though he did still give her an allowance. Now, quick side note, you're going to see a lot of things that don't line up perfectly here. For instance, as the biographer Nina Boyd points out, Mary had her father's conservative values and would exempt herself from what she considered to be best for women in general. This becomes more apparent later on.
Guess I'll look out for that.
We do not know for certain what Mary was doing prior to 1909 when she was in her early 30s. We know that she did actually believe in women's suffrage, but she also described herself in her second memoir as being restless and full of energy. So it's not surprising that she joined Mrs. Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union, also known as the WSPU.
Ooh, the radicals.
Now, Nina Boyd points out that Allen was always falling under the sway of charismatic women throughout her life, and in the case of Emmeline Pankhurst, Mary would follow her anywhere.
And she goes a lot of places.
And I think it's safe to say that Mary looked up to her. Now, her own involvement starts with organizing meetings and handing out flyers in the southwest of England, but soon Mary moved to London to take part in the more militant activities of suffragettes. You may recall the story of a suffragette being trampled by a horse at a derby in 1913. Mary was the one to organize that woman's funeral parade in London. Prior to this, though, she got arrested in 1909 for attempting to petition Parliament in what might have been a minor riot. From there, she spent time in a women's prison. In her book Lady in Blue, she said they had no toothbrushes, hairbrushes, or mirrors. By her account, she slept on a bed of planks and a pillow of straw when the lights went out at 8, only to get up at 5 a.m. the next day when she probably didn't sleep much.
Wow, so great conditions.
It's at this point that I need to point out that Mary had been a frail child who, at one point, was expected to grow up to be somewhat of an invalid. It's probably due to this that she asked for special treatment that wasn't always given. For instance, in the women's prison, they gave her milk for her health. I find this sort of scenario hard to imagine in a modern prison. I feel like there would be more metaphorical spitting involved at such a request.
So, one benefit of the sexism of the time is the general perception of women as these frail creatures might actually have helped her in this horrible prison environment.
This first stint lasted only a few months, during which her and the other inmates would sew votes for women into the shirts that they were stitching. Mary's release was then greeted with a dinner at which she spoke of the solidarity of her and those prisoners. This wouldn't be the only time that Mary gave speeches as a suffragette. Side note, apparently getting arrested didn't result in her allowance from her dad being revoked.
It's really decent of him. I mean, so far we've seen her do a lot of things that are against his values, and that's nice of him to be like, hey, your financial independence is not conditional on doing what I ideologically agree with.
Speaking of arrest repercussions, she didn't have to wait long for the second. It came in about 2 months, still in 1909. This time it was for window breaking at the Home Office. Specifically, she broke one panel on a door.
Okay, so it's she's not fully destroying this building.
No, it's not whatever scenes of riots you have seen across social media and the news in the past few years. This second sentence was only 1 month, partially due to the fact that hunger strikes were starting to become part of the movement. Mary decided to join in. The prison conditions were also worse this time around. She was kept in solitary underground. After 2 days, they tried to tempt her by brewing tea in front of her and brought mincemeat and chicken into her cell. Mary claims that she was released 5 days later after eating and drinking nothing. For this, Mary was the first to receive the Hunger Strike Medal from Emmeline Pankhurst in August of 1909. Her third and final arrest was also in 1909.
Busy year for this lady.
It is a year for her. It feels like she is speed-running delinquency. This time, she also again broke a window panel, but it was at the Inland Revenue Office in Bristol.
She just loves breaking those windows.
Thus began a 14-day sentence and a second hunger strike. Rather than let her go this time, they sent Mary to the hospital prison and force-fed her. Now, I'm sure we have all heard of suffragettes being force-fed, but I was surprised to read the details of this, and I'm sure some of you have had the same misconception. I had always imagined they pried your jaw open and forced food into your mouth, and it was sort of a swallow or choke scenario. It's not like that, actually. In this case, 6 women wardens held Mary down while a pint and a half of an egg and milk mixture was forced into her via her nose for 2 minutes. Meaning they stuck tubes up her nose and pumped it through those tubes. Which does make sense. The whole, your nose and mouth are sort of connected at the back and they all go down the esophagus. That is a thing.
That sounds like so much fun for everyone involved.
Yeah, this resulted in illness, which led to her release this time. It turns out becoming ill from this was apparently not uncommon. There was another case that resulted in double pneumonia due to food particles entering the lungs. In Mary's case, it just seemed to affect her stomach instead. There's a letter from a niece or sister that mentions she had some sort of digestive ailment for the rest of her life due to this, but it doesn't say what or any details. By the way, the force feeding wasn't just a one time thing. They force fed her twice a day until her release, to the acclaim of her fellow suffragettes on November 26th.
Boy, that's gotta be traumatic, right?
Yes, you're having tubes shoved into your nose twice a day and food pumped into you while six people hold you down.
I don't think she needs a prize. I think she needs therapy.
Well, it is 1909 and she is not getting even the beginnings of therapy under Freud.
Which, I mean, to be honest, maybe for the best.
Maybe, considering some of the things HD's episode contains about the beginnings of psychology. So, from here, rather than therapy or relaxing, Mary has decided she will do less vandalism in favor of organizing the vandalism.
Got it. So she's a bit more behind the scenes.
Yeah, she is not going out and participating in the bombings and arson that begin by 1912. However, her response to such events was that as half of the population were women, they owned half of the UK's possessions, and so they were just destroying half of their own stuff in a bid to get the right to vote over what to do with their own stuff and themselves.
That makes sense.
And then came World War One, which brought an end to such bombings.
Right, there were enough explosions going on around then.
So you may be asking, what does Mary do now? Join the war effort, of course, but not as a nurse nor as an ambulance driver. She instead decides to join the Women Police Volunteers, aka the WPV, under Margaret Damer Dawson.
What exactly is a police volunteer?
So, a police volunteer is, of course, not an official police officer. You see, when the war started, there were opportunities some people saw for women to join into policing groups. Essentially, it's part of the whole, oh, we have to send all these men to the front lines, so we need women to start doing more things, which is how you also end up with women ambulance drivers who end up sent overseas.
Got it. And of course, they're not going to pay these women or train them or officially recognize them as police officers. No, they are merely volunteers.
Though the fact that they are only volunteers will later create friction. Now, Dawson's group is initially created because she heard rumors of Belgian refugees being preyed upon and whisked off by slavers once they arrived in London.
Do we know if any of that actually happened? Or you hear a lot from like in 1800s, I want to say, all through like mid 1900s of people talking about white slavers as if it's a thing that definitely exists, but I have only ever heard of it as a conspiracy theory. Or not even conspiracy theory, more like an urban legend.
So, without going into a research rabbit hole that will probably take us an additional hour just to find something that can confirm or deny definitively, I cannot tell you for certain. I can, however, tell you that Mary claims about hearing these rumors, and I can say that considering it's a bunch of refugees fleeing in the face of an army, there's probably a ton of chaos at the ports. There's probably many people who fall into scams, who end up in situations that they otherwise wouldn't because there just isn't a system that is robust enough to suddenly take care of all of this.
Okay, so there is something to the idea of there needs to be someone looking out for these vulnerable people.
Yes, but I would say that it gets exaggerated. Now, this group from Dawson is not the only group. There are other voluntary patrols that spring up because there's an influx of women and girls hanging around army camps. Some of this is partially influenced by a purity movement with the thought of saving women from their own folly. The police actually preferred using these voluntary patrols, by the way.
Because they didn't have to pay him.
They didn't have to pay them, they weren't really responsible for them, but they were sort of helping to deal with unruly soldiers going out on leave, that sort of thing. It's the whole, if you've ever looked at a lot of wars and how administrations do things, even if you go back to, say, like the US Civil War, there's a lot of talk between the authorities of how do we deal with camp followers, how do we deal with brothels, and it's all focused around how do we deal with venereal disease.
Of course, they're too polite to say that outright.
Yes, this actually, fun fact, this is why prostitutes are sometimes referred to as hookers, because there was a general hooker in the US Civil War who was more lax and lenient towards camp followers following them around, so it became known as Hooker's Army, this second shadow army following the official one everywhere.
So we've mentioned this Margaret Damer Dawson. Who is she? Do we know anything about her?
Dawson actually started out in animal welfare work, especially slaughterhouse reform. She ended up being awarded medals from Denmark and the Finnish Society for the Protection of Animals for that work. We do also have what Mary thought of her. In her eyes, Dawson had remarkably diverse and contradictory gifts, was keenly interested in sport as well as in all the arts, an experienced alpine climber, motorist, gardener, a passionate lover of animals. In short, Mary liked what
Mm,
she saw. So they essentially end up enacting the U-Haul trope.
good for them.
And this is where it is posited that even if her father now doesn't support her because it's never clear how she finances everything that she does, Dawson has her own money and it is thought was also supporting Mary at times.
Got it.
Now, by the end of 1915, the Women Police Volunteers is now called the Women Police Service, with Dawson as its chief.
I mean, it sounds more official than it did before. She's the chief of police.
It's still not really official, it's sort of a gray area, which comes back to bite them later.
Ominous. So, what are they doing? Have they changed from what they were doing before, or are they still just this volunteer group helping people at the ports?
So it's a bit difficult to figure out the aim of them versus the others, but it seems to have been to protect women and children both from men and from themselves. It's rather reminiscent of the bizarre statements I have encountered from people in the modern age of the internet, because Dawson actually believed that there was no place more dangerous for the British child than the public park.
Ooh, stranger danger, but more so.
This was in addition to the belief that the excitement and confusion of the war and the absence of men in the family home to be disciplinarians had negative effects on children.
Right, we all know that children need to be put in their place.
Yeah, I don't really agree with that part. Everyone else in their family could also be giving out discipline, but I will agree that the absence of parental figures would have a negative impact. So, mixed bag there.
Right. Yeah, no, they're not entirely wrong. And you know, scary things do happen in public parks. It's just maybe not the most dangerous place.
But back to World War One. There was some support for these women police, as there was discussion of women having a difficult time approaching male police if they had a problem. Sometimes the cops would lead them into bad situations, as it was called, which seems to be a euphemism for leading them to brothels, but I am not sure.
It also have been a thing that still happens today where cops will rape women and then say, well, you can't report this because you would just be reporting it to all my buddies who would cover for me.
Could also be that. So there was some argument here for well, a woman could just talk to the women police and crimes would actually be reported, or if they needed help, just finding their way home. Now, there was actually a training regime for these volunteers, but it was only 4 weeks long. According to Boyd, this was focused on psychology, police court procedure, police law, children's courts, factories, social conditions, drills, and patrols.
Okay, that actually seems pretty reasonable. It's not like actual police officers get like a 4-year degree in it, so.
Now, Mary was the one to design the uniforms, and she took inspiration from the military for it. Add to that the cropped hair of both Mary and Dawson, and the male police were uneasy. There was also an argument as the uniforms of a different group, the Metropolitan Policewomen, were very similar to those created by Mary.
Now, are the Metropolitan Policewomen actual policewomen, or are they also one of these volunteer groups?
That is difficult to tell, but I would say that they have more official standing than Mary and Dawson's group. They're much more supported by the official police and the authorities.
Got it. Man, there is so much ambiguity in this time period about which authoritarians you should actually be listening to.
But enough bureaucracy because Mary did do more than design and paperwork during the war. There was a point where they were employed to help the military police prevent soldiers from getting into trouble at the training camps. Despite all of the talk of helping women, Mary and the others did care more about impressing the male authorities in charge of the police activities. So a lot of the time she had to find missing soldiers, which sometimes involved running into sex workers. And while there was assistance for women during all this, it turned into more lectures and was less popular than places like the Salvation Army. By 1918, the group was allowed to arrest drunk and disorderly women, but Mary had gone off to train recruits to police munitions factories and army camps by then. As the war ended, she thought this would continue, but it didn't. To her disappointment, the authorities disbanded the group quickly despite her protests that the problems of demobilization would lead to an increase in drugs and white slavery in London. And if you're confused as to why I keep saying white slavery as the term, it's because it's the one used by Mary and even by her biographer to describe her thoughts on this. Today, we would probably just call it human trafficking.
Right, but she had a particular focus on which victims she wanted to protect.
Yes, it does indeed appear that that was the case. Then 1920 arrived, and it was a terrible year. Dawson died that May of heart disease, leaving an inheritance to Mary, who then became the chief of their volunteer police force. She then had to face the authorities accusing them of looking too much like the Met Women Police. She would have to pay fines over this in the coming months. This was in addition to running for local office in 1921 as an independent. She didn't win.
Now, I am a bit confused here. If she keeps on getting into trouble for looking too much like the more official women police, why doesn't she just join them?
Because it's her group.
Because she likes being in charge of her organization and she doesn't want to be subordinate to someone else.
Yeah, I get the sense she just doesn't want to give up being in charge of her own group at this point and organizing it. It may be also some ideology clashes here and there preventing that. Now, though, I bet our audience here is wondering how we get to Mary from the other women in this podcast.
Yeah, who exactly does she know in this group of radicals and artists and poets?
Well, it turns out we go through Radcliffe Hall. I wouldn't be surprised if they met because of the suffragette movement that Hall stayed on the fringes of, but I haven't found a clear statement about that, unfortunately. We do have mentions of a Mary Allen, sometimes called Robert Allen, in books about Hall. Without further information, I'm not going to clearly state with certainty if this is the same woman, so I'm not going to include those passages here. You can look them up if you so wish, though. So we do know, for this episode, that a Toto Goldingham introduced the two after the war. According to the brief section included by Nina Boyd, the two attended several lunches together and Mary read Hall's books. But back to politics, and here I must again include a section that has less information. So the original British fascist organization was not started by Oswald Mosley, as many may assume. It was started by Rotha Lindtorn Orman, who got involved with the 1926 general strike with her British Fasciti. And now that YouTube has thoroughly decided it doesn't like this episode, Mary also got involved with the general strike. She may have met Rotha then or may have met her before. I say before because in about 2018 or 2019, I came across a link in a Reddit post for a book on auction that had a message written in it from Rotha to Mary. Assuming this is true, they knew each other in about 1921 or 1922 and might have had a fling. Unfortunately, since then the internet has worsened and searches for Rotha are buried under Reddit posts talking about the same biography section on her starting the British fascists or her being modded into Paradox strategy games.
Not relevant.
So if anyone could find this again or definitively prove I hallucinated, that'd be appreciated. But if you do say yay or nay in the comments, provide sources. But now back to the 1926 general strike. Mary thought this was a good opportunity to show that women police can actually do useful things in an emergency. Don't go thinking this was in favor of the strike. It was not.
Oh no. That that doesn't sound like, based on the general vibes that I'm getting from this group, I'm not thinking that they are in favor of a strike.
No, it is too much communism for her to agree with it.
So Mary and Rotha and their friends are strike breaking.
Well, Rotha certainly is strike breaking. Mary, in her official response, or in an indignant response to someone describing this, said trade unions, from performing vital and praiseworthy offices for Britain's workers, had changed after the war into domineering political organizations whose chief objective seemed to be to grasp the government of the country. May 1st, 1926, being International Labor Day, was chosen by them as an appropriate occasion on which to put a pistol to the head of England and demand her surrender to a communist coup.
You know, it's funny, I've heard that one before.
Yes, so while Mary did end up gathering a force in the end, she also, it sounds like, is charged with impersonating the police because at least one official actually mistook her for being part of the Metropolitan Police.
So she's still not quite official enough to actually act as a police officer, and she's still unwilling to actually work for the Met, but she is definitely willing to use an imagined authority to put down strikers.
She isn't officially a police officer, so she may have been arrested for the fourth time in her life. It does not appear that she was brought to trial, which is confusing. There's then several officials going back and forth over this, straight through to 1931, in part because she also travels abroad, and when she's abroad, she's considered to be an official police officer from England, but when she's home,
By whom? Or does she just say that? Who believes that she's an official police officer, and is it because she just tells them, oh yeah, I'm definitely police in England?
It appears to mainly have been because of the uniform. Because this is the main snafu focused on in all of the correspondence that Nina Boyd includes about this. It's constantly back and forth over this uniform. It's like she's going down to Brazil and making speeches to institutions, and people like her speeches because she's apparently capable of connecting to just ordinary people when she's talking, which is quite a good skill. Not everyone has that. But then you have like the Foreign Office and the British ambassador talking about her, and it's like they're alarmed.
Mm, I would be too. It's so ironic that she is so into like authority and policing people, and she gets arrested 4 times, and half of that is for impersonating authority and not going through the proper channels.
Well, the fourth time is murky. The other three times are definitely for doing things you're technically not supposed to do, but she wanted to be able to vote. So,
Yeah, I guess that is interesting. The suffragette thing we normally think of as being a liberation movement, but you can also see where that's her trying to get authority too. It's just maybe in a way that we feel is more justified than some of her later work.
yes and no. I think when she's in the suffragettes, because it turns out she has a knack for organizing things and making speeches, Pankhurst and the others just take advantage of that. And so she gets used to it over like 4 or 5 years, all the way to the start of World War One. And then she's looking for something else similar to that, and she just falls in with Dawson,
Hmm.
and it just compounds.
Yeah.
That said, I will, side note, point out from my reading and Boyd's book and everything else, there is not a suffragette to fascist pipeline. This is odd. It's very odd for a suffragette to veer off in this direction.
Mm. She's special.
I would say uncommon. It's not what the typical suffragettes do. There are instances of it, but they're usually drawn in much later. So after this whole hullabaloo over the 1926 general strike and her uniform, the 1930s are when she falls in with Oswald Mosley's group of British fascists, not to be confused with Rotha's group, which they split from.
Now, this is a completely different group of British fascists.
This is also where we again see her more rules for thee and not for me type of thinking. At one point, Mary is saying stuff like how, for the majority of women, being a housewife is great, and in the same breath, she's also deploring married women's rights, but it just doesn't apply to her.
Right. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on here.
There is also the time that she met Hitler during all this.
Oh my God. Really?
Yes,
I thought that she was fascist enough. Okay, so how did that go? What did she think of literal Hitler?
she described him as a man after her own heart and who she believed to be one of the greatest orators who ever lived. She seemed to approve of his receiving war veterans and youth organizations, his love of music, and his ruthless weeding out of the enemies of the Reich, according to Nina Boyd.
Oh my God. Wow, she is really in that pipeline now.
In short, she found no faults in him.
I did not expect her to be quite this fascist when we started this.
Well, he also wins her over by talking about anti communist measures.
Hmm. Which is the way to get a lot of people. I'm not really on board with all this fascism, but man, those communists need to be told a thing or two.
That has described so many people throughout history. By 1940, UK officials were so concerned they wanted her imprisoned, in the same way that the Americans, for instance, imprisoned Japanese Americans during the war because of fear. Though in this case, it's much more justified. Now, this led to a back and forth with the courts in which Mary protested an order that she was to be sent to St. Just in Cornwall and unable to travel more than 5 miles from it without permission from the constable. The detention order came with a search of her house that turned up British Union of Fascist membership cards, a political fascist book, and anti Semitic pamphlets. Quite damning when Mary protested that her membership was not motivated by anti Semitism or politics.
Yeah. No, and we haven't seen a lot of her outward actions be explicitly like anti-Semitic or anti any particular group. It's more been systemically that way.
Other conditions would be changed later during World War II, but she remained of interest to British authorities. The restrictions were only fully lifted in November 1944.
It's good that they finally got her though. I mean, for a while they were seeing her as part of their government apparatus, so it's good that Britain finally saw that what she was doing was not cool.
Mary herself was in poor health by the end of the war when she was 67. It may have been this that led to her giving up politics.
For real?
Yes, because for the next 19 years that she lived, we don't have any details other than stuff like she became known as a dog lover.
It's a better pastime, I think, than the other stuff.
We do know that she had another lover after Dawson and through World War II, Helen Taggart, who then dies of cancer in the 1950s and leaves an inheritance to Mary again, but still it must have been a blow to her. Beyond that, we really just jumped to Mary's death from a series of strokes at age 86 in December 1964. So I suppose that ends part one of a section we could call Lesbians Behaving Badly.
It's one way to say it.
We start off in an okay or even good direction because suffragettes, and then we veer wildly off course.
Boy, do we, at least in her life. So we are to expect more fascist coming down the pike.
At least one more.
All right. I mean, I guess you can't talk about this time without addressing a lot of the people in this era who really thought some messed up things.
Definitely. This is another case to remind you you should not put people on pedestals. They are not saints. They're not filled with light, goodness, rainbows, whatever you want to think. They're always a mixed bag. There's going to be stuff you don't like, there's going to be stuff that you hate, and there's going to be times you think they're complete and utter morons.
Mm-hmm. There's gonna be times that your hot lesbian in uniform is using that uniform to oppress people.
Thanks for listening to Paris Lesbos, the podcast that goes down some of the oddest rabbit holes in the history of lesbians, mainly between 1880 and 1945. You can find us on podcast apps and YouTube, even our own website. We welcome your comments, any suggestions on what historical ladies you want us to explore next. And remember, there really are gay people everywhere, even in fascist movements that you don't want them in.